Okay, so we're going to talk about some exemplary microorganisms. You're going to be exposed to, well, not literally exposed to microorganisms, but you get the gist. So I always prefer to start with something that I don't like, so we're going to start with fungi. So fungi, eukaryotes, there are two types of them. Molds, multicellular fungi, usually reproduce by spores, okay? Form the long chains called hyphae and stuff like that. Pretty boring, right? And then yeasts. Unicellular fungi, most commonly reproduced by budding. Basically mitosis, cell division. Okay, so far we good? Okay, awesome. Now, there is a third type of fungus. It's called dimorphic. It's really interesting. So dimorphic fungi are molds in nature, and they grow as yeasts in humans. The most likely trigger for such change in growth is a temperature. If you walked, when you walked out of your house this morning, it was pretty chilly, right? But the temperature in our body is 37 degrees Celsius. So what scientists think is that the change in the temperature switches the mode of growth. An example of such dimorphic fungus is Histoplasma capsulatum, which is a mold in nature. It's the potentially pathogenic fungus which causes the condition known as histoplasmosis. Okay, we're good so far? So what is histoplasmosis? It's the fungal pneumonia very often it runs unidentified. People experience a little bit of shortness of breath, cough, and often it is self-limiting, so it goes away without any intervention. However, in immunocompromised individuals, this infection can become systemic, resulting in systemic histoplasmosis is uniformly lethal, if untreated. If untreated, it's treatable, but if untreated, it's uniformly lethal. Are we clear? Okay. Now, transmission route. It's respiratory transmission, so people inhale spores. And this infection essentially is the zoonotic infection, meaning that it is acquired by inhalation of the spores produced in the bird's feces, okay? The particular, well, it's, everywhere in the forest, so the profession that is at particular risk for histoplasmosis is lumberjacks, because when those trees fall and they, aerosolize everything and people inhale large doses of the spores, they get more exposed, basically. Does that make sense to you all? Okay, sweet. That's your fungi. Next example of eukaryotes, protozoa. Okay. So I chose a very rare disease caused by, well, okay, let's talk about protozoa first, in general. So protozoa are unicellular, eukaryotic organisms without the cell wall. It's basically a definition, the lack of cell wall. Okay? So there are 3 or 4 groups that we're going to use. It's not a formal classification, it's not taxonomy. We're going to group them by the way they move. First will be Sarcodina, okay, which is amoeboid motion. Okay. Then we have mastigophora. These use flagellum. Then we have celiophora, which use cilium. And finally, apicomplexa. Apicomplexa are unique in their own right because they do not move. Okay? Now, if you think about why organisms move, they move to acquire food, right? And all these three groups of organisms, Sarcodina, Mastigophora, Celiophora, can basically chase their own food. Are you with me? Apicomplexa can't. This is why all apicomplexan protozoa are obligate parasites. They must live inside another organism. So Sarcodina can be free living, Mastigophora can be free living, Celiophora can be free living, Apicomplexa can't. Okay, we're good? Now, which microorganism did I choose? I chose Nigleria fowleri. So it's amoeba, or Sarcodina, okay? It's a free-living amoeba found in water and soil. And here's the infection for you. I'm pretty certain you've heard about this infection before. When kids especially swim in the warm water of a pond or lake, they play around and they snort water, and water goes into their noses. And the water reaches the roof of the nasal cavity, which is formed by a cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. In that cribriform plate, there are tiny little openings for the filaments of olfactory nerve. Filaments of olfactory nerve extend straight into the olfactory bulbs that are basically next to your brain. So when kids snort water accidentally, amoeba can accidentally cross the cribriform plate and end up in the brain. That makes sense? Which results in, I'm going to do the acronym, primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. BAM. Meningoencephalitis implies that there's an inflammation of meninges and the brain itself. So usually kids present to the physician with really high fever, headaches, confusion or altered mental state, and stiff neck. This is the list of symptoms for classic bacterial meningitis. Those kids are usually treated for meningitis. A couple of days later, when antibiotics don't help, it is too late to start treatment against amoeba because the brain damage is too severe. So generally speaking, for this condition, the prognosis is very poor, unless the diagnosis is made very early. So I'm aware of cases when it was not made early and kids died, and I'm aware of cases when it was made early enough so kids survived their treatments. Those infections occur mostly during the summer months, because that's when everybody swims around, right? And in the southern states, because it's really, really hot there. Okay, and it thrives. Any questions? Okay. So second best microorganism that we're going to be talking about now, group of microorganisms, are helminths. Now here, helminths can be formally and very, very properly divided into three categories. That's proper taxonomical division. So you've got nematodes, roundworms. They have a body cavity, and they have sexes. So they have male and female worms. Then we have trematodes. So these are non-segmented flatworms. No body cavity. They are hermaphrodites. And finally, most primitive cestodes, which are segmented flat. And just like trematodes, they don't have a body cavity. They are hermaphrodites. Okay. Those are
The last one.
hermaphrodites.
No, what are they called, the actual worm?
Oh, cestode. S-E-S-C-E-S-T-O-D-E-S. Cestodes, yes. So those are only 3 types of worms that cause human disease. They all are multicellular. They are eukaryotic. Overwhelming majority of them can be seen with the naked eye. Now, the classic example of a tapeworm, of a cestode, is the pork tapeworm. And we're going to discuss its life cycle, and it is really fascinating. So pork tapeworm, Tinea solium. Since we're talking about the life cycle, there's no start, there's no finish, but we're going to arbitrarily choose one point as a start. That's going to be egg. Usually it is in soil, but think of it this way, egg in the environment, okay? So egg in the environment gets consumed by a pig and hatches into the larva in the pig intestine. Larvae that have hatched in the pig intestine penetrate the walls of the intestine and enter the tissue of a pig. So larva ends up in the pig's muscle. Did anyone recently buy a pig's muscle? Yes, no? Yeah, I just cooked it yesterday, yeah. Yeah, so that's basically pork, right? So we humans eat pork. So now we have larvae in the human intestine. Which develops in the adult worm in the human intestine, which starts to produce about 100,000 eggs per day. Okay? The cycle is over. Well, not over, but it's established. Does that make sense? So let's kind of discuss a few things here. First of all, this little fella, it's not so little, can be up to 5 feet in land. There are reports of bigger worms. Okay, they're pretty substantial. I believe there were examples of worms like up to 40, 50 feet long. Okay, they can grow pretty large. So these worms have a little head called scolex. They use hooklets to attach to the wall of the intestine. They will hang off of the wall of the intestine in the intestine. Yeah, sure. In the intestine, what are they feeding on? Your nutrients. Nutrients that are in the intestine are absorbed by a worm by diffusion. This is why they flat, a huge surface area. Okay, that makes sense? How much do they absorb? Very, very little, so you're not going to get any thinner if you have one. Are you going to have any symptoms? Most likely, no. Maybe a little bit of bloating. There was a case of a woman with 3 pork tapeworms in the gut. She knew nothing. They were discovered during the colonoscopy. Okay. They not only releasing eggs, they also can release. So these worms, they segmented. Each individual segment is called a proglotid. they can release proglotids full of eggs. Does that make sense? Now, of course, last time I checked, let's say I hope I don't, but let's say I have a tapeworm. Like I'm walking around my house, I didn't see any pigs running around in my house except my kids, or here at Lakeland I didn't see any. So the chances of me transmitting this to pigs are pretty small, but if we're talking about a farm, that's the different story, right? People tend to pigs, and those eggs are literally everywhere. Like everything is going to be contaminated, so it's pretty easy for the egg to end up in the pig again. That makes sense? What can we do to kind of terminate the cycle? Well, we can deworm people. It's pretty easy. There are drugs. We can check pigs. Pork that is sold in the United States in the grocery stores is pretty well inspected. Okay, so we're pretty safe here. And we can cook it thoroughly, because when we cook it thoroughly, they all die. Okay? Now, you may think, okay, what's the problem? You know, like having a little neighbor down in the gut is not such a big issue. Well, it can be in one particular case. So imagine that this egg gets accidentally consumed not by a pig, but by a human. So it will hatch into larva in the human intestine. Does that make sense? Well, when it happens, what do larvae do after they hatch in the intestine? They go into the tissues. So you end up with larvae in the muscle, which causes myositis, inflammation of the muscle, and the brain. That makes sense? So this condition is called cysticercosis, or neurocysticercosis. It's the leading cause of epilepsy in the world. Okay? Does that make sense? Because this fella, when they end up in the human tissue, they eventually will die and will cause massive inflammation. All right? So this is why it's kind of important to identify people with a tapeworm and treat them, so they will not, because they're going to be shedding a ton of eggs, and it's a real risk for other people around them to, develop this condition. Questions on the tapeworm? No, we're good? Lovely creatures.